Want to welcome everyone to our monthly symposia for the Great Plains Idea CTR network. Appreciate everybody joining us today. I think you're in for a treat today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ted Michaels. I'm the director of our professional development core for the CTR, and I'm joined today by Chi Zimmerman, who's our co-director. And it is a real pleasure for both of us to be able to introduce Dr. Rusty McCulloh today. I think many of you who are on, it looks like by names I'm seeing, know him. Dr. McCulloh is Associate Vice Chancellor for Clinical Research at UNMC, and he's the Vice President for Research at Nebraska Medicine, leading many of the clinical research initiatives for our academic health system. Dr. McCulloh also serves as a Medical Director for Clinical and Translational Research Operations at Children's Nebraska. And he joined UNMC and Children's in 2018 and is part of the NIH-funded Nebraska Pediatric Clinical Trials Unit, which focuses on conducting high-quality clinical trials and engaging children and their families in underserved areas. And I think that's going to be a focus of the talk today. So Rusty, thanks again for joining us, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Great. Well, Ted, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for making the time today. I hope to share information, insights, and experiences that can help you and other team members in your journey to try to extend opportunities for children, families, and others to participate in clinical trials. And some of you may have seen a few of these slides at a presentation that I did in Kearney. Fear not. There is additional stuff in there, so there is still new information to share. So without further ado, just a couple of disclosures. I do receive funding, as Ted mentioned, from the National Institutes of Health, and I do have a grant through the Merck Investigator Studies Program focused on vaccine communication related to HPV and COVID-19 vaccine. So our objectives today are to review barriers to clinical trials participation that are faced by rural communities, but really can be extrapolated to other medically underserved communities, to understand the role that informatics and mHealth and some other approaches can play in engaging individuals and communities in clinical research and clinical trials, and to review some ongoing and future endeavors to expand clinical trials across communities, rural and other underserved communities in Nebraska and really nationwide that we're participating in. So I'm going to take one step back and bring us to a 20,000-foot view. Why do we do this in the first place? And as I had mentioned to the rural practices that I was presenting to earlier in the month, that research is often a series of unremitting failures and frustrations punctuated by moments of scintillating success. And if you're looking for something that rewards delayed gratification some of the time, research is that thing. If you want instant gratification, take care of a patient. And I think that's so I have maybe a bit too much empathy, but a lot of empathy for those who are in the trenches in clinical and translational research. But we do clinical trials in particular because that's the gold standard of the evidence that we have. It's the most rigorous. It tells us things about effectiveness and safety that you really can't find through other forms of research. It's also the most complex and difficult in many cases for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about later. When we say clinical trial, there are actually definitions for that, but it's important to note that this can be focused around a few areas: screening for a disease, prevention of a disease, diagnosis of a medical condition, or treatment of a medical condition. And so it doesn't have to be any, it doesn't always have to be of a drug. This could be of a screening test. It can be of a bundle of behavioral interventions. You don't have to put something in someone, device or medical, for it to be a clinical trial. And that's important to note as you're thinking about research. Maybe you're looking at quality improvement. There's an entire branch of clinical trials that's focused on implementation science. And it's important to think about as you're considering designs for studies to address topics that are important to you. And I think for clinical trials in particular, the best trials are those that are trying to address a vexing problem to patients and to communities. And that can run the gamut. All right, so when we talk about clinical trials from a more medical and device standpoint, though, keep in mind what we're considering is a numbers game, both in numbers of participants and in years. Many of our current innovations in medicine have been the product of decades of research. As a example, when people think of Project Warp Speed and the COVID-19 vaccine, that was building on 3 decades of research in novel vaccine approaches. It was not something that was invented overnight for COVID-19. It began with hardworking folks in labs like those that we see in DRCs 1 and 2. And that really it's only at the phase 2 and phase 3 of clinical trials where we're talking about lots of patients with a condition of interest, where we're trying to figure out the effectiveness or the efficacy, depending on the design of that intervention. This also does not reflect other study designs in real world settings, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go along. All right, so what's the problem? All right, well, we've explained that this is how we do it. How could this be that hard? And there's a lot of things that you don't know that result in something that you see in front of you. I give this example that wolves are majestic creatures. As much as people love French bulldogs, I don't find them necessarily majestic, and they didn't get there all at once. For rural folks in particular, and you could extrapolate this to other resource-limited settings that we see in our communities across Nebraska, there's things that prevent folks from getting into clinical trials. A lot of these are around where those trials are available and who is engaged in those trials. And for me, it's very important, although I see many clinical trialists on this call, it's at least as important to have those folks that are day-to-day clinicians who are engaged in patient care and at presentations like this and others, to understand that they are a critical link in extending opportunities to folks, because most often people don't know of the availability of a trial, and when they do know of availability of a trial, it's hard to get to. Things that facilitate this is community engagement, and engagement is a long-term initiative. This is not something that you can immediately jump into. What are the logistics? So how are you getting something to someone, or how are you getting someone to something? I will say that the latter is often more acceptable to participants than the former. And then incentives. How do you, incentives may be from a standpoint not of financial, and for those who are members of the IRB, I'm not talking about that. That would be reimbursement for time and trouble in a trial, which is also important to consider. The bother factor for being in research, which may or may not directly benefit you, is an important consideration to keep in mind when you're designing a trial or considering participating in a trial. We actually did work on this through the Pediatric Clinical Trials Network, of which I'm a part, to summarize where those gaps in those barriers and facilitators to clinical trials participation fall. And I'll be touching on some of what we found as we go along here. This next figure, however, comes from the American Cancer Society, and I think it really helps illustrate what it looks like if you are at a place that, similar to UNMC, is in many ways research optimized, versus if you're in a place such as a practice in rural Nebraska, or a private practice setting, or a public health setting that may not be optimized for clinical trials participation. In a research optimized site, you have many trials that are open at that site that could be available to folks, although you want to make sure many does not mean meaningful if you have not matched it to your population and the values and priorities that they express. That there's a systematic pre-screening of patients, meaning that something in the background is helping you know who you should be talking to about different clinical trials. There's always this step of identifying eligibility criteria, and somebody's got to do that, although there are means of automating that. And then there is, for studies that are engaging in individual enrollment versus other designs I'll talk about in the later on, there has to be a human being talking to another human being about the study and answering questions and providing space for that person to reach their own conclusions about whether they wish to participate. For a non-resource site, many of those things are missing. With it, at the front end of the funnel being one of the biggest barriers, which is not having enough trials that you can connect folks to. But also having fewer staff and just not those resources in place that make it easy for someone to learn about an opportunity and decide whether it's right for them. What goes into that decision-making, though, also matters. So yes, the front end of the funnel, do I have things that I'm being connected to? But then what prompts someone to say yes or to say no? And the number one thing, and I want to highlight this for anybody who is a loved one or a healthcare provider or a trusted neighbor, is that recommendations from a trusted source is the number one factor that prompts engagement in a clinical trial. When you look at, from a system standpoint, an individual's own healthcare provider is chief among those, even ahead of friends and family in most cases. And so if we're not talking to our partners and colleagues, if we're not doing the studies ourselves, then we're missing out on an opportunity to raise that awareness and to provide information that would lead towards someone seriously considering and enrolling in a clinical trial. Higher socioeconomic status, well, that right there predisposes to disparities in access and the generalizability and the equity of generalizability of our research findings. The receipt of tests or treatments that are not otherwise available. That doesn't mean they're beneficial to you, but some people, to have that additional piece, to say, I've got more going on in the treatment of this thing that is important to me, myself, image of myself, my own vision of how I'm effectively tackling whatever condition is concerning me. Sometimes more is better in some folks' minds, and having that additional wraparound diagnostic or treatment, even if it's not yet proven effective, is important for folks. The benefits are intricately tied to that. The travel and logistical barriers, the bother factor of a study. As an example, I remember looking at a clinical trial when I was a fellow that was around an RSV vaccine, and you had to subject a child to, I think it was 8 nasal washes. For any of you who have done a nasal wash of a child, you will do it precisely once for a clinical trial and then say, I'm out. And so that's an important factor in this, both in the design of a trial, but also in the discussion of a trial. And then, of course, compensation for time and trouble. It needs to be commensurate with the hardship that to which we are subjecting families, so that everyone has an opportunity to engage. And no matter what, if you're enrolling kids versus not kids, it's less likely that the parents or caregivers are going to be accepting. And when you are talking to adolescents who are not yet able to consent for themselves versus their parents, adolescents are more likely to say yes to a clinical trial than their parents. So there's a lot of well, frankly, paternalism and maternalism that goes into, or parentalism that goes into that. This map is a few years old, but one of the things I want to highlight here is that if you're looking in Nebraska and you're not in Douglas, Sarpy, or Lancaster County, you probably have some opportunities to be working with a corporate outfit to participate in clinical trials in many cases, and that's it. Right? You can see those smaller dots are probably places like Columbus and Kearney, maybe North Platte, those sort of areas, but they're tiny dots. That means that we're not delivering all of the trials opportunities that we could be to our friends and neighbors statewide. And that's pretty much the story around here, right? All those dots are pretty much cities, right? If you look at Arkansas, that's Little Rock, as an example. And so that's important to keep in mind, because that if you think about where people are having to drive through in our own state, it's a long ways from Scotts Bluff to Omaha. Now, why should we care? Beyond the fact that clinical trials are how we identify new treatments and improve health outcomes, being in the trial itself can have benefits when you're in a health disparities area. What I want you to see on the graph on the left is a comparison of mortality rates among individuals with the same type of cancer who reside in urban areas versus rural areas. Now, many of you already know that in rural areas, we lack resources to provide all of the same medical services, despite the fact that we have many dedicated, hardworking healthcare providers in those areas. Two of these in particular, lung and bronchus cancer and colorectal cancer, you can see there's significant differences in the mortality, and this is per 100,000 people. So if you're going from 30 or about 40% to about 50%, that's a 20% increase in the mortality rate for lung and bronchus cancer if you reside in a rural area. Now, if you are if you have colorectal cancer or lung cancer and you are in a clinical trial and reside in a rural area, your disparity in mortality goes away. I'll say that again. If you're on a clinical trial and reside in a rural area with those cancers, your the mortality disparity that you face goes away. And the reasons behind that are likely multifactorial. But the first and foremost, is you got more brains and eyes on you than you do otherwise, right? That doesn't mean that other people aren't adhering to best practices, but you have more resources that are brought to bear when a clinical trial is in place that removes that disparity in outcomes. All right. We've talked about that. There's a lot of challenges. I love Calvin and Hobbes. I think the last panel on the bottom right here is where I feel like I am oftentimes as I'm conducting a clinical trial with my butt up in the air and wondering what just happened, but hopefully smarter at the end of it. And I'll start with a few examples from personal experience. This first one I think of as how to step in it and recover. The trial here was called I Am Healthy, and it was a distance-based intervention to provide the resources and 25 contact hours that has been proven, evidence proven, to be effective in helping improve body composition, meaning weight for height and lean body mass versus non-lean body mass among children through a parent-child dyad interaction with dietitians and counseling to get that 25 hours of exposure. The first problem, the stepping in it, was that we began working with a clinic in Kearney, Children's Physicians in Kearney, that had recently joined that practice and had been working with the amazing individual I've got in the picture here, Dr. Kate Heelan at the University of Nebraska Kearney, for years on weight interventions and clinical trials. And she had inadvertently had contact kind of severed as that clinic moved from private practice into the children's physician system. I did not know the amount of research that she was doing. And so as I was bringing this clinical trial out that was funded by the National Institutes of Health, did not realize that I could be inadvertently stepping on some toes. Thank goodness for the CTR, because Paul Estabrooks, who used to be the head of the Community Engagement and Outreach Corps, knew Dr. Heelan, and we were able to establish a connection that both enhanced her research platform and led to an extraordinarily productive collaboration that continues to this day, including organization of a rural community advisory board that she and her team maintain in partnership that we use for researchers at UNMC and UNK and other places. That little thing on the right is COVID-19. That's the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And what messed up this study once we were in the field was that as recruitment was starting, we moved into a remote-only procedures. Which meant that those things that you see in the bottom left, the weight, the scale, the tape measure, all that stuff, we could no longer do at the clinic because we could not be at the clinic and people weren't coming to the clinic. So what did we do? We pivoted to remote procedures. We established logistics where all of the weights, the scales, the stadiometers, which is the thing that says that helps you measure height, the tablet that they got as part of the intervention, all were shipped to the family's house. We did remote consent procedures. We taught them how to do their weight and height via teleconference. And across the four sites that were participating, ours along with Delaware, South Carolina, and West Virginia, we were able to achieve our goal enrollment. We enrolled actually 33 total with more at our own site, and we maintained more than 85% retention during the 6-month intervention period and in the follow-up period. So what did that tell us? We could pivot. As bad as the pandemic was, we learned important lessons that we have brought to bear in other studies on both logistics and remote consent procedures. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a bit. Additionally, some opportunities that we learned was that a participant that no-showed to an appointment didn't impact travel to a rural site for the study team, right? So we didn't have as many folks as we do now based in central Nebraska, and so this helped us effectively engage with a rural practice without losing a bunch of time and without wasting money. Because we were able to do those procedures remotely. The participants were able to keep the weight scale and other equipment that we sent to them, which was a benefit to them. The tablets had to be given back, but the rest of that stuff, you can use a tape measure for more than just measuring your own waist and height. We were able to also validate the use of virtual versus in-person methods for doing some of these biometric assessments. Challenges that we learned, including at UNMC, were our limitations in the e-consent process, which helped inform changes that have been made since to IRB resources. There were some sites that tried to mail things directly from Amazon out to the participants. That didn't work out very well. What we did in Nebraska is we basically warehoused and did it ourselves centrally, and that was a whole lot more efficient. The other thing that we learned was that in rural areas, that last mile for sending equipment out is really tough because that may be a PO box and not a person's house, right? So how do you get those materials so you make sure they actually reach the door of some of those areas, particularly if you're off a dirt road, not even a gravel road, or if you're in a trailer park and you have a PO box but no mailbox in the park. So our second one is another COVID adventure. At the time that the vaccines were first coming out, we had found that they were 90% effective in preventing disease and death among particularly older adults, but we knew less about how the virus was transmitted between individuals, particularly young adults who had very few symptoms. There was a lot of social distancing and mask wearing that was being done, but we didn't know household transmission, and we didn't know transmission when folks were in college settings. A very large study was planned with universities across the country, including universities in the Big Ten. University of Nebraska-Lincoln declined to participate in this study, and instead we went with the University of Nebraska-Omaha. We were going to give injections of vaccine versus placebo based on the age range that was still an ethical thing to do at the time. So they received standard of care prevention measures versus vaccine. We were anticipating, we had this all geared up to go to the Scott Center. We were going to have hundreds of participants that we were going to follow. And then, very appropriately so, when the resources were available, the federal government rolled out the vaccine to all adult ages. Well, that changes the equation. If you don't already know this, individuals who think about the COVID-19 vaccine are often very bimodal in the distribution. There are those who are early and enthusiastic adopters, myself among them, and there are those who have very high degree of hesitancy. In between there is a group that I lovingly refer to as the distracted cats. They haven't been paying attention, and they're just not strongly motivated one way or the other, right? And so you're trying to get them to commit. It was difficult in Omaha, and again, we were able to collaborate with the University of Nebraska-Kearney to extend opportunities and use the Health Science Education Center, the part of the building that already existed that the College of Nursing and Allied Health Professions maintained. So we used their Sim Center actually to deliver the vaccine, and we had which helped us with enrollment that was, although a fraction of what we intended, still was a very meaningful contribution to this study, which ended up being ended early due to enrollment delays nationwide. But we also had outstanding retention. And this was a means of bringing in rural populations that was not otherwise represented in this trial. So didn't end up with the Big Ten university, but we got 2 others that were involved. So a nice in-use system collaboration. And just in case you all don't know, in this building that they're putting up, which is going up quite efficiently and rapidly, we have a clinical trials unit that we have put in place with spaces for research coordinators, centrifuges, -80 freezers, spaces to do consent, your biometric assays, and with really outstanding collaboration with College of Nursing and especially College of Allied Health Professions. Laura Bielik has been an amazing sponsor and promoter on getting that area set up. And so there'll be opportunity for collaborations with UNK faculty and with cross colleges within UNMC to leverage that space. And if you've got any questions about it, please don't hesitate to talk to me or to Nikki Carrot, who has been spearheading much of this work over the past several years. Okay, the next study that provides opportunities for engagement of clinics and that leverages mobile health devices, we put through the network and using software that we developed here that UNMC and Children's Nebraska funded the development of the software and was focused on vaccine communication. This study was comparing a general health application that we developed using the software with a vaccine communication app focused on COVID-19 vaccine that was developed using a very intentional recruitment of individuals from communities facing both health disparities and COVID-19 disease severity, but also in vaccine uptake. We use the health belief model, which is that little figure in the top right there, to organize the intervention elements in there, which included push notifications through the app, customization at the clinic. That's why you see a University of Kansas Medical Center clinic, because they were one of the clinics that participated. Those 2 smiling gentlemen are healthcare providers within that clinic who were providing tailored messaging to patients in their clinic who would receive the application. And also a demographic-based messaging on the specific communication themes that was informed by qualitative interviews. So a very thoroughly, intentionally developed communication tool versus a generic general health app. We ended up exceeding our goals for diversity of enrollment. We were across 29 clinics in 15 states nationwide. We had more than 30% rural participants enrolled, and more than 40% of participants self-identified as a race or ethnicity other than non-Hispanic white, so a diverse cohort and a rural cohort, although the caregivers enrolled were about 95% female, as may reflect the predilection of moms to be at clinics when doing the enrollment. At Nebraska, the site involved both faculty who are in Kearney. Top right is Dr. Angie Cradaville-Stava, who's an amazing advocate for clinical research in primary care settings. Dr. Gwen Scar, one of our PEDS ID docs, and Dr. Helen Grace, who is at the Durham Outpatient Center clinic. So we had both an urban clinic and a rural clinic. We had more than 90% adherence to the protocol. I cannot give the full results because those are not out for public consumption fully yet. Long story short, our vaccine rates were abysmal in this group. who were post rollout to children. And so again, we were dealing with those who were more hesitant than the population at large. The only place we did see a difference was among rural parents and caregivers, where they were about twice as likely to complete the vaccine series if they received the communication tool, as opposed to the general health app. So again, highlighting the value of designing studies that intentionally engage rural populations. Okay. This is near and dear to, I think, many pediatricians. And if you know anything about the opioid epidemic, you know that there are many victims in it, adults and children, and that one of the biggest maladies that afflicts children is something called neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, which is basically the mother is taking opioids. There is systemic absorption, it crosses the placenta. There is adaptation neurologically to that exposure in utero. After delivery, there's sudden removal of that opioid, which results in irritability and other symptoms that can be extremely distressing, both to the infant, but also to the parents and the healthcare providers. And historically has required a prolonged treatment with a weaning protocol with opioid medications and an assessment scale that was coupled with it. There had been quality improvement initiatives that had suggested that a more pragmatic approach using just what's called the eat, sleep, console technique, which I describe as holding your baby, feeding your baby, comforting your baby when they are upset, that it may be as effective, if not more so, than using a lot of opioids and the traditional scales. But quality improvement does not determine effectiveness. It does not determine efficacy, right? And so anytime you're doing quality improvement and you think you are adding new knowledge to an intervention, you ain't. That's why you can get away with not having a IRB review, because it's not human subjects research. Which means that as important as it may be, it does not drive policy. It does not drive a change in the science. And so think of it as a great component in our armamentarium to improve outcomes, but it's not the driver of new knowledge in that way. We can learn about implementation around that some, but even there's something called implementation science that is really going to give you information on how best to implement. And again, not to besmirch QI, but it ain't enough. So there have been no clinical trials to date on this. We were fortunate enough to participate in a trial focused around this, where we had neonatal intensive care units participate, where they, at the unit level, changed from the traditional Finnegan-based scale and interventions for symptoms of opioid withdrawal syndrome to the eat, sleep, console method. Where they were all trained. And there's a lot of reasons for that. If you think about it, if you have two different nursing scales and rules of engagement, that is extraordinarily confusing. It's not really feasible at the end of the day to be doing that with fidelity, meaning that you're adhering to everything that you're supposed to. And so you really wouldn't be able to tell at an individual level, if you'd randomized them, unless you were spending a whole lot of time and resources, that you were actually giving them the thing that you thought you were giving them. We ended up doing this across 26 sites nationally. Nebraska Medicine was the neonatal intensive care unit here locally that was able to participate. We had 837 infants that met the primary outcomes, which was looking at length of stay and symptoms. And what we found was that the time until medical readiness for discharge, meaning that those symptoms had resolved, was 6.7 days sooner if you went through Eat, Sleep, Console than if you went through the traditional method. And I just wanted to let that sink in for a moment. If you have an infant in the NICU who's term, who doesn't have other healthcare problems, dropping a week is quite possibly dropping most or all of that inpatient stay, right? The other piece that came to this was that there was improved bonding between the parents and the child, and that there were improved interactions with the caregiver teams. and the healthcare teams and the caregivers and the child. And I think that illustrates the power of this sort of study. Pragmatic, a true reality-based intervention addressing a gap that is very meaningful. The study design is cool as well, right? So I was talking about this a little bit. When you think about study designs, individual randomization is what we often think about. You got a target population. Within that is who's eligible. You do individual consent. They get randomized. They get A or they get B. That's labor intensive. That's hard to do for things like a whole change in practice. Clinic-based interventions or unit-based interventions are cluster randomized, right? Where you've got the unit of observations actually the clinic. That's a whole lot easier because you don't have to do the individual consent, because you are able to better ensure fidelity for those interventions that are amenable to having the clinic or unit change practice. On the right is the practice-based research network that is organized and run by the IDEA CTR. And all those little dots are opportunities to participate in these sort of cluster randomized trials. And so when you're thinking about the sort of research that may be implementation science-based, think about these little dots and Emily Frankel, who runs the PBRN within the CTR. To facilitate that is FIRE, which is a method of making electronic health records data at different clinics comparable, so that you can look at that data instead of having to collect information via manual review. And this diagram's not important for you to understand in depth. It's important for you to understand that this allows many clinics with disparate electronic health records deployments to engage with each other. And this is work, again, that the CTR is supporting that is going to revolutionize the way that we can do implementation science and other clinical research, clinical trials using real-world data. So distance should not be a barrier. This is my last of my team's studies, and I think that this is a great one to look at equity of engagement. This is a project that we have partnered with the Title I-C Nebraska Migrant Education Program on through an NIH program called the Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics in Underserved Populations, or RADXUP, which is focused on getting COVID-19 testing into the hands of individuals and eliminating the disparities in access, because we know that testing leads to earlier detection, leads to earlier treatment, leads to better outcomes. On the left, you see the state of Nebraska, and every school district is mapped out jurisdictionally on there. All the blue is where we have at least one family, well, more than one family, because otherwise they could potentially be identifiable, but the families who are enrolled in the program statewide. That's 99 households and over 400 individuals, about half of whom are children. Notice that 94% of them speak Spanish as their preferred language. So the short answer to can you do clinical trials that engage non-English speaking populations in Nebraska, my answer to you is yes. So what we did in this, just very briefly, we had two components to this app-based program. One was on screening for COVID-19 through risk and symptom screening. You were prompted to test through the app and report your test results back. All of that was recorded in a dashboard that enabled decision-making from a health promotion standpoint. The other piece that we did was social determinants of health screening and provided an opportunity for the families to request assistance from a family navigator who is based in central Nebraska. We actually built an outstanding clinical trials team that is still active in central Nebraska, comprising both a rural-based nurse and bicultural, bilingual healthcare research professionals who are some of the most outstanding professionals I've worked with. And so in answer to can you recruit and train high-quality research professionals in rural Nebraska, the answer also is yes. This is just a little bit about some of the screens that were there, and then a little bit about the data flow. So you can see here on the left are requests for assistance, and then the different categories of social determinants of health risk. This is civic tech. This is getting to folks who otherwise may not have a voice in what what their needs and concerns are. This enables those who traditionally are not heard to be heard in clinical trials and demonstrates how you can reduce disparities and increase equity of access through technology-based approaches, even in rural settings. All right, and then I show this here at the end just to say, hey, you can use this app, not this specific app yet, but you can use app-based with FHIR, and then you've got clinic-based interventions that can engage patients and healthcare providers leveraging EHR data. So you can do some truly innovative work on health promotions. And all this is here, folks. These resources are on this campus and facilitated through the CTR, among other resources. Okay, I'm going to do to close out with just a couple of national initiatives and just to tease some NU-based initiatives. We're in an exciting time for the University of Nebraska system. We have a new president-elect, will be a new president. There'll be changes in leadership on this campus, as well as openings in leadership that exist on other campuses that are going to help drive innovations in research policy and research opportunities for our faculty and for the communities we serve. So it's a great time to be here. I have the NU extension logo here because this is one of the partners that we're working closely with to advance access to clinical trials across all communities with a focus on rural communities. The University of Nebraska Extension, it's an agricultural extension. It's funded by the United States Department of Agriculture. It is in every county in the state. And there is a One Health focus, which means, both our food supply and our public health and healthcare apparatus, they're all intimately linked. And we're looking at ways to effectively partner to extend resources and opportunities that help engage every county and the communities in those counties in clinical trials. That is part and parcel in line with initiatives that are going on at the federal level. This first one that you see in the bottom right is called Advancing Clinical Trial Readiness, which is in its early stages, and it is funded through the ARPA-H program, which is the Advanced Research Project Agency in Healthcare, that was stood up in the past year and a half or so, with many transformative collaborators that they're trying to fund, and this one in particular, looking at clinical trials access. The goal of the ACTR program is to improve the nation's ability to conduct clinical trials safely, quickly, and equitably. It's important to advance, integrate, and extend those capabilities that overcome challenges in evaluating new technologies, therapies, and platforms for reasons that I've already told you about. And what they want to do is enable more Americans to take part in a clinical trial within a half hour of their home. That's ambitious, right? Go to a frontier county in Nebraska and say to yourself, all right, how do I get this to within 30 minutes of all of these places? It's exciting. There's 5 tasks that they've highlighted. I'm only going to talk about 3 because we've got some connectivity with things we're already doing at the university. The first one is that they want to accelerate patient enrollment in clinical trials. And that includes developing computational methods that reduce manual effort. I'm sorry. I wish I had turned off my Outlook. That reduce manual effort to identify and enroll clinical trials participants, and also to develop patient-centered consent processes. On that, what are we doing at UNMC? Well, we're doing a lot. One of those is that we are working to bring resources from an organization called Trinetics to enhance our identification of clinical trials, which will improve our selection of those we bring in to the enterprise, and improve our feasibility, assessing how many folks we can actually enroll in those, right? Right studies with the right estimated enrollment improves your relationships with sponsors and improves your efficiency in engaging in those as clinical trials teams, improves your margins, gives you an opportunity to further invest and grow that enterprise for the benefit of your patients, families, and research teams. The other piece to this is around remote consent, which we've done a lot through the UNMC IRB, which, just as a reminder, serves several community organizations, but also the University of Nebraska, Omaha. So if there's anybody from UNO who doesn't know that, we are at your disposal. And 2 of those are our remote consent processes, which I've used hundreds of times, literally, and our e-signature processes. And I give you the links on this PowerPoint, which I'll send along to the CTR folks for you to access and look at those resources. But ways to remove distance barriers are bringing the consent process to someone's home. Now, Trinetics, just very briefly, this is a global network. We are not the first. We'd be like the 281st system to engage with them. They've got a lot of experience. They connect clinical research organizations and pharma and healthcare organizations and data partners to create an environment where you can do outstanding feasibility queries and identify studies from industry sponsors in particular that they're partnering with so that they can better connect. It's free to UNMC because they get paid by pharma to help connect sites for initiation of trials. And sites, those pharma outfits are interested in it because they provide better feasibility that's more reliable than what we often do as investigators, which is our gestalt, our gut. Or if we're really fancy schmancy, we'll use Slicer Dicer from Epic. Although I will highlight that our new research, education, administration, and development in health informatics, or Ready Corps, does provide these services as well, which the CTR supports. So they also provide access to real world, help create an environment where real world data is synced up, which can give ideas around business intelligence for planning. Where are your priority areas? If you're designing your own clinical trials for submission to external funding agencies, this helps you understand, do I have the populations? What populations do I have? What disease states relevant to my area of focus as a researcher or research team can I feasibly get off the ground here from a pilot through larger investigator-initiated trials. So we don't have this yet. We're working hard on this, both from a Nebraska Medicine and UNMC standpoint. I'm very excited for it to be implemented in the coming months. So task 2 is around shifting clinical trials closer to the points of care, including developing decentralized designs. I showed you one of those, the cluster randomized design. Identifying and incorporating emerging tech in clinical trial systems to enable faster and less expensive and decentralized trials at the point of care, so in the clinic or in the home. And then statistical methods that demonstrate ways to use real-world data in a decentralized context, leveraging that FIRE base that we talked about briefly earlier. And what are we doing here with partners? We have author software that the UNMC owns, modular progressive web applications. Full disclosure, I'm a co-author on this, but I don't make any money off this sucker. It's something that I'd be happy to discuss with folks offline. The work with the practice-based research network and FIRE that I talked about, and then health information exchanges like Sync Health, and then Crane, which provides opportunities for leveraging that real-world data from the electronic health record. This is Crane. A little bit about the data flow of Crane. And I put this on the task 3 slide, which is about creating data platforms and software tools to distribute, run, and collect data from a common clinical trial protocol across geographically distributed locations. PCORNet, which stands for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network, is a clinical data research series of clinical data research networks where they do trials like this. There are opportunities that come through not infrequently. That are opportunities for investigators to get involved with and that leverage data and can be more efficient both in identifying participants, but also conducting the trial itself. Finally, just to give you an idea of what folks were focusing on when they were surveyed, we were one of these survey responses to ARPA-H. We had highlighted the importance of framing and scoping efforts aimed at advancing those clinical trials, working with patients and providers and other stakeholders and engaging those, improving access to clinical trials by underrepresented populations, communities, and using the decentralized and hybrid approaches that we talked about. These are all national priorities that have been identified that align with many of the priorities that we have here among our research community. With the remaining being around technologies to reduce barriers, applying existing healthcare standards and common data models to clinical trials, which is ongoing efforts, and then engaging with the regulatory bodies to ensure that these issues are addressed. We are trying to do that as well through UNMC, and then making sure that we can transition these trial innovations to independent financial sustainability, which is a hard thing to do. One last plug for a national initiative so that you're aware that we've at least signed on once as a university and health systems, both health systems, is the Community Advancing Research Equity for Healthcare, or Care for Health, which is looking to engage primary care practices as part of a network infrastructure to deliver clinical trials and clinical research opportunities through those primary care practices, and to engage diverse practices across the country in that sort of research. So lots of opportunities that are coming down the pike. And we need more primary care-based research and partnerships. And if you've got those ideas, I know folks at the CTR and both in the Office of the Vice Chancellor Research are extraordinarily interested in talking to you about those. So in summary, clinical trials access is not equitable. Rural communities, as well as other medically underserved communities, face significant barriers to access. The successfully conducted clinical trials in such settings require strong community partnerships, which I only lightly touched on in this talk, and resources and strategies that overcome the logistical barriers, many of which we've covered for idea generation. You got to be dogged, and tech can be a huge enabler here. And finally, clinical trials access improves patient outcomes. Why should you, as a clinician, care? It's because this is the means for helping your patients live better. And I think that's it.
Rusty, thanks for a great talk. If folks have questions, you can put those over the chat. Excuse me. I guess I'll start. This is a little bit tangential, Rusty, but I was going to ask you a question. You made this comment that I happen to really agree with about quality improvement projects and how those are often the end all be all, it seems like, but not necessarily evidence driven. I mean, that's my take. They're tested before we have evidence they work. And since you have this unique position, both on academic and hospital side, you have this unique perspective that I think other people don't have. And how do you blend those? How do you blend quality improvement work with academic rigor that, I would want behind, to generate evidence, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say first, from a historical perspective, I started in QI sort of work when I was a resident, and kind of, although I did some bench research when I was an undergrad, I really fell into clinical trials as I went along and was frustrated, right? Because you can only implement those things which are, which you have evidence behind. And a lot of times those things are just not sufficient. And so I think the place where they intersect well is around implementation science, where you're often taking new discoveries and saying, how do I get these into practice? Because the delays there are immense, right? And so having the QI champions and having the components around implementation to ensure that occurs is, I think, where you can get the QI focused folks and the research focused folks more in sync, right? Because this is all part of a trajectory, right? Bench to bedside to implementation to policy, back to bench. And that's where it is. I think it's having the right teams that have both those components in there and recognizing the limitations, right? So when we do clinical research, we're not serving the clinical care need first, because the rigor is higher, and it can stumble into some extractive work that you have to keep in mind, because the way you do chart review for QI is not rigorous enough for clinical trials, as an example. And so you have to devote more effort on that and be more nitpicky. And so I don't know if I totally answered your question, but that's where I go with it.
No, it does. I mean, I think the focus on implementation makes, a lot of sense. Implementation science. Chi-Chi, did you have a question? I think you might have.
No, I was just looking in the chat here real quick. I guess a lot of what you were saying, Rusty, too, does deal with kind of this technology and being able to deliver technology to these rural sites and underserved sites. Is there any interest, you think, on campus to have like an interest group or a SIG group, or, that people could, because it's really hard figuring out who's doing what?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point. So there's a few forums where there's some opportunity for team members other than investigators. I don't think we have quite as many for investigators yet. For coordinators, we have quarterly calls. I see many people that are on those regularly, Deb Meyer, as an example, where those teams are often sharing out practices, and that's broadly available. From an investigator side, a lot of the times that has been done at the department level or sometimes at the college level. I can speak for my home department, the Department of Pediatrics. We do a research mentorship series on Fridays, kind of a works in progress that we try to encourage folks to come to. A lot of it is the convening has to be convenient. And we've had challenges around that, and mixing both in-person and virtual has been a challenge. So I would love ideas, and I think this is a great place where the CTR and the Office of the VCR can really help be, master conveners on that. And so, that would be my first answer.
Rusty, there's a couple very practical questions in the chat that I'll sum up for you. One is an investigator from Kearney who's new and working towards clinical trials, at least new in terms of working towards a clinical trial. And the age-old question about mentoring and who they can contact, specifically at UNK, but thinking about our other partners who might be on the call, maybe some mention at UNL or other places.
Yeah, so first off, I would say your new VCR, Kim Carlson, is a great resource. She's very passionate about helping. She's been very active in, I think it's a Sigma Chi out there, and the science cafes. And so I think she'll have a lot of contacts. Kate Heelan is an outstanding individual to work with, who has experience in clinical trials out there. Of course, I think the CTR has a lot of resources that can help here. I've referred many people. I've gone through the design studio series that Ted and Chi-Chi have helped coordinate. I think that's an extraordinarily powerful tool if you are at any stage for your research project when you're looking at investigator-initiated trials. And then our clinical research center, while they are more focused on regulatory and coordination, you could always contact individuals there at UNMC. And myself and Dr. Matt Lunning, who's the medical director there, if we don't know a person we can refer you to, we will try to answer the question ourselves. And so I think those are some of the resources off the top of my head for someone at UNK. And I can't speak highly enough of the CTR resources in this area. That the design studio I've been greatly enjoyed and benefited from that process several times.
The other clarification question was just on Trinetics, and it was about the, basically the timeline. It sounds as if we are in the process of having the Trinetics collaboration in place, and this specific question is around ability to use that data and analyze data from that. What do you think, Rusty, in terms of timeline on that?
Oh my gosh, I wish it was yesterday. It's the short answer. I'm hoping that by the fall, or at the very latest by the end of the calendar year, that we have that where we're offering, at least initially doing the rollout and offering. It may be sooner. I will say our chief technology and information officer, Frank Bogatz, on the UNMC side, and Scott Raymond, who is the head of IT for Nebraska Medicine, are doing great work together on that, along with Ashok in the Research Information Technology Office. So we're pushing. It's we have a governance and academic management committee for this sort of stuff, and this one I put as the top priority from the clinical research side.
Yeah, sounds great. Other institutions have overcome those barriers, and we certainly will do it as well. So it's
absolutely
great to hear. Well, I think that leads us actually 1 minute over, Rusty. So you have to send me a bill for that extra minute. Really, really appreciate you coming today and joining us. It was a wonderful talk, and hope everybody has a good weekend coming up.
Thank you so much.